Hey, it's Mr. Norton with Education is Fashionable, where we do things like advanced placement European history, government classes, economics, and the occasional professional development video. Today we're going to be focusing on a government video, and the reason for that is it's almost around the time where we have a test, our first test for government, and students typically have trouble with certain things that are on the test. Most importantly, students usually struggle with concepts with the Articles of Confederation. So, stick around, that's what today's video is going to be about.
Flashing lights, flashing lights.
All right, so as promised, we're going to be doing some Articles of Confederation. So, taking a look at the ship here, this nice little political cartoon I was able to find, and a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about today are basically in this cartoon. Things like no national court system, no power to collect taxes, no power to raise an army, and there's some other major ones in here too that we're obviously going to be able to make sure we cover today. So let's go ahead and see what our goals are for today. In the learning targets, we're going to compare and contrast the powers of the state versus the national government under the Articles of Confederation. That'll help you basically determine why they weren't very good. And basically, we're breaking down what caused the Articles of Confederation to start. So, sometimes you guys are like, why am I even doing these things? Why do I even need to have a lesson on the Articles of Confederation? So, I actually took the time to show you what it is that I have to take a look at. So, teachers get these documents that say, hey, this is everything you need to teach for your particular class. So, here in Michigan, this is part of the document, so you can see how we're actually covering. More importantly, let's see where are we at right here. Where did it go? It's gonna be right here, Articles of Confederation. So explain the historical and philosophical origins of American constitutional government and evaluate the ideas found in, well, the Articles of Confederation. If you peek through here, you see a couple that we've actually talked about in class before too, like Magna Carta and English Bill of Rights, but we're going to just stick with the Articles of Confederation today. So, first thing you need to know is, what were the Articles of Confederation? Well, most people, if you talk to them on the street, if you're like, hey, what was the first Constitution of the United States? And they probably just think that the U.S. Constitution that we have right now is, what we've always had. And it's not. The U.S. Constitution is what replaces the Articles of Confederation. So, they're actually the first Constitution of the United States, as it obviously says right there. Now, they're created just after the Declaration of Independence in 1777 because with the new country, you needed some sort of rules to govern by. Now, granted, they didn't get ratified until about 1781, and the American Revolution didn't end until 1783. So, these are going to be the documents that rule the country or basically set up your national government, how it functions, all the way until you get around to the U.S. Constitution. So, what exactly is the best analogy, in my opinion, for the Articles of Confederation? Well, I always say in class that they're nothing but a dumpster fire. And you might be thinking, okay, they're a dumpster fire, but why are they a dumpster fire? Well, I'm glad you didn't ask, but anyways. It's because the states are afraid. The states are basically afraid of a government that's too strong. You have to put yourself in the mindset of the people who were living back then. Their biggest complaint and fear, is that the British government was too strong, and because of that, they were ignoring their rights. So basically, you have this mindset of, I don't want to repeat that. For those of you who are with me who have had, who've done the ratification of the Constitution, that was one of the arguments. It's like, well, I don't want a government that's too strong. We just got rid of one. But so that was the main fear. And what you end up with is a government that's extremely weak. And you have to keep in mind, too, is that 13 states really like to do their own thing. The way they acted inside of this Articles of Confederation Union is just kind of like they all wanted to be their own country. Now, that's my opinion. You might have somebody tell you differently, but it's kind of like, prove me wrong. So how do the Articles of Confederation actually work? Well, it's a confederation, and if you've been in my class, you know that a confederation, the way that it's set up is basically the regional, or in our case, the states, have basically an overwhelming amount of power, and the national government is extremely weak. So some other issues, there's no executive branch. And so basically it's just a legislative body. and that's it. And they don't have a whole lot of a whole lot of power, but we'll get into those in a moment. Other things they don't have a national court system. I talked about it being a legislative body. It's a unicameral legislature. It's got equal representation, so everybody's got the same say, and it's one representative per state. Some other things that really hurt them is you can't make laws regarding trade. Now in class I talked about how that basically leads to 13 different sets of trade laws because there are 13 states and they all make trade basically favorable to themselves. It becomes very difficult and very confusing on how to trade. If you look at the Constitution today, the only government body that can actually make laws regarding trade between states is the national government. So, depending on where you're at in terms of your studies, you may know that, when we cover the Constitution, we basically talk about how it specifically addresses and fixes all the things that were wrong with the Articles of Confederation. Some other issues, too, is that in order to pass a law, you needed 9 votes. Now, that's a lot. 9 is not that much, but there's 13 states. So, the thing that I like to emphasize in class is just on how difficult they made it. The percentage of 9 out of 13 is actually higher than it is to overturn a presidential veto, which is 2/3. And if you look back throughout history, especially in recent history, overturning a presidential veto is extremely difficult to do. So you're making it harder than it is in modern times to overturn a presidential veto. So basically, the moral of the story is laws rarely ever got passed. Now, if you thought it was difficult to pass a law getting 9 out of 13, well, if you want to change the articles themselves, it has to be unanimous. So if you've got 11 states that are like, yes, we need to make these changes to the articles, then you know what? 2 say no. I mean, if it's just 1 that says no, and we'll talk about that in a moment, it doesn't go through. You take a look at the United States today with the Constitution, it's not anywhere near as difficult. Not that it's easy to get an amendment ratified because you got to have 2/3 of the states. I'm not going to get into the big specifics because there's 2 ways to propose, 2 ways to ratify, but it's 2/3 to propose, and then it's 3/4 of the states basically have to say yes. It's certainly not anywhere near, the 100%. I mean, back then there were only 13 states. Imagine if you still had the Articles of Confederation today with 50 states. How impossible would it be to make a change? Well, let's talk about some powers of the national government. They do get some, and it's not a whole lot, but it's basically the only powers they have are like things you'd expect any country to make just because they have a national government. Sorry about that. You get to organize the division of western lands. Now, if you don't understand what that means, is there's a bunch of land west of the 13 states that the United States picked up as a agreement with Britain to end the Revolutionary War. So the United States consists of the 13 states and all the land west to the Mississippi River. So that's where that fits in. Anytime states had a dispute, they could actually settle those disputes, and I'm not exactly sure how that occurred, because when you look back at the national court system with it not having one, that's pretty much how disputes between states are settled today is with the federal court system. Something that you still see today, they had the ability to organize a postal service, so hooray mail. They could coin and borrow money. And so that just means that you can print your own money. And obviously you should know what borrowing money means. So other things, you can appoint military officers. Now, it says raise an army. Now, if you look back at the political cartoon in the beginning, it referenced the inability to raise an army. Now, here's why that's the case. They can raise an army, but the way that this worked is you had to ask states for troops. And normally what I do in class to try and give a good example of this, and this goes with money later on too, is I go around, I pretend that I'm the national government. I start asking kids for money or just other things, and they all say no because I ask for outrageous things, or they give me just a little bit, or and pretend whatever. And that's what the kids are acting as states. I basically have to, I have to ask for everything. I don't actually have the power to do it on my own. And some other things too is you have the power to declare war and make peace. And the other thing, one other thing that's not mentioned on here is you have the ability to go and do foreign diplomacy, so you can make treaties and all the other things that a regular national government would do. So basically what you end up with is one ridiculously weak government, which obviously you can see that is not a picture of me, but that is, well, you get it. Okay, so let's talk about the state governments, which are pretty much shown by this gentleman on the right. So they can collect taxes. Notice I didn't have that on the previous slide because the national government could not collect taxes. Now, for those of you who've had economics with me, the issue we just didn't get there because we had to move at a slower pace, but oh well. But the main source of revenue for modern-day government, and really, I guess just governments in general throughout history, is taxes. So keep in mind we have state governments who are able to tax, but your national government can't. The other thing, they are supposed to enforce national laws. Now here becomes the issue. In modern times, with the U.S. Constitution, it's the executive branch that enforces national laws. If you're not following the laws in the states, well, one of the president's main jobs is to make sure those laws are actually being carried out. But remember, there's not an executive branch. So what you end up having problems with later on is states begin to basically pick and choose which laws that they're going to follow. Like, oh, I like that law, so, I'll follow that one, and I don't like that one, and I'm not going to follow it, and you know what, the national government can't do anything about it anyway, so, you can go pound some sand. And as I mentioned earlier, you can decide whether to contribute funds to the national government, and that goes with troops, too. They get to make laws regarding trade, which I've already prefaced, and Congress can't, which we've talked about, too. And the other thing that is different is that you could coin money as a state. So what you end up with right now is 14 different currencies. So that's kind of a problem because you might not even recognize the currency from another state. You don't even know if it's real. So this becomes another barrier to trade between the states because some states would just openly decline accepting currency from other states. So what does the national government basically turn into? Well, the national government basically turns into a beggar, which is, well, being shown here. Or at least that's the picture that came up when I looked for one in a Google search. Anytime the government wants something, it basically has to beg the states. And as we've talked about so far, they don't actually give them anything. And this becomes a giant problem as we start to try and grow as a country. Now, basically what you have the United States being right now is they're living up to the nickname they had actually gained on the international scene. Their nickname wasn't, well, the United States is their real name, obviously, but the country's nickname was the Disunited States because they all acted in their own individual interests. They didn't act actually united. So that's another issue that goes on with the Articles of Confederation. So we basically have had enough information laid out there where you can compare and contrast the powers of the state and national government as far as the Articles of Confederation go. So let's move on to our second learning target. And I'm going to actually include some things that wasn't mentioned in many of my classes. If you got the lecture portion from me, you heard this, but I think there was only one class, so it's actually going to be some new information for much of my students. It's not in your textbook either, so that's the issue. Just from teaching 8th grade, I know most of the information around the Articles of Confederation because it's a major topic. But anyways, problems with Britain is, well, the United States was occupied by Britain, and the territories in the western portion of the United States, so the areas between the states and the Mississippi River, have British military forts there, and they won't leave. So you start thinking to yourself, well, how would I actually make them leave? Well, that would pretty much require that you have an army. And the big problem here is that you don't have an army, because when you ask states for troops, they basically are like, oh, can't help you. So basically, Britain doesn't actually leave, and they really don't leave until the War of 1812, but that's in American history, not a government thing. Also, Britain is basically doing everything they can to ruin your economy. Remember, they don't care about your economy anymore because you're not ruled by Britain. And so it's in their best interest to basically ruin your economy. So here's how they do this. Britain is one of the, well, is the superpower as far as manufacturing. So they can make it and sell it. I'm sorry, more specifically, sell it for cheaper than American businesses can actually make their products. So basically what happens is they just dump all these cheap goods into the United States, and American consumers, just like you probably would choose the cheaper product. And the thing is, it was probably of better quality too. So you're getting like two bonuses. I get it for cheap and I get it better. And so this is ruining American industry. Now, the way that countries deal with problems like this, and it's actually relevant to the time that I'm recording this video, is they create a tariff. And why I say it's relevant to right now, that's because President Trump has gone ahead and slapped tariffs on foreign steel and aluminum, which drives the price up. And it's supposed to make it easier for American businesses to compete, but it's the same thing. Now, the issue with this is that a tariff is a tax. And if you recall from earlier, a tax is not something that the national government can do. So in order to actually put a tariff in place, the thing that you're going to have to do is you're going to have to actually change the Articles of Confederation. And that's not easy to do, which we've already highlighted. You have 12 states that say, yes, let's go ahead and put a tariff on it. Let's change the Articles of Confederation. But what ends up happening is, I said 12, and as you know, there are 13 states. So that one dusty bum of a state, Rhode Island, if you're in Rhode Island watching this, you're not really dusty bums. But anyways, say no. And so they shut down the entire thing as far as this movement to try and fix the economy. And, well, as you can see, nothing happens. So Britain continues to tank your economy. You have some other problems that aren't mentioned in your textbook that kind of relate to something that we've already talked about. You're still not under the protection of Spain anymore. Protection of Great Britain. I mean, think of it. Spain is going to leave the colonies alone when they're the colonies because they're ruled by the baddest country that is on earth at this time. You don't sit there and hit the dog, the rabid dog, the pit bull with a stick and try and tempt it into biting you. Well, when the United States beats Great Britain in the Revolutionary War, well, they don't have that protection anymore. And so Spain, who controls some territory west of the Mississippi River, and basically controls the Mississippi River, shuts it down. The United States doesn't have any access to it. It makes trade extremely difficult. Let's see. What are some ways that you could possibly try and get Spain to reopen the Mississippi River? Well, the two options that I can think of, you could pay them. You could kind of pay a fee, but you got to keep in mind you don't have any money because states aren't going to pay you anything and you can't tax. The other way would be, maybe you got to start another fight. You might have to use some troops and actually go to another war, but what troops are you going to have? States won't give you those either. So those are some additional problems that weren't mentioned in class, but with all but one class. So that's actually going to be something that, if you're in my class, you might want to brush up on these things because you might see them you might be able to use them for a written portion on a test later on. All right, so let's review the problems. We've got too many currencies. There's 14. Everyone makes their own trade laws, so there's 13 of those. Government's broke. They don't have any money. We already know why, because they can't tax, and nobody will give them any money. You can't enforce national laws, and some states actually start negotiating with other countries, which you're not supposed to do, but they do it anyways. It's extremely difficult to pass laws, and it's even more difficult to pass the Articles of Confederation. Now, there's one last event that basically breaks the back of people who are wanting the Articles of Confederation, and that's going to be an event called Shays' Rebellion. All right, so some of the ways that states are trying to repay their war debts, because all these states from the Revolutionary War have war debts, is they're just printing money. Because as we saw earlier, you have the power to print money. Now, if you took my economics class, you know what you should know what one of the problems are with printing money is it creates this massive amounts of inflation. So Massachusetts tries to do the smart thing. They go, I don't want inflation to occur. I don't want runaway prices. So we're going to try and tax our way out of these debts. And so that's what they do. They just start slapping taxes on lands. Now, some of the problem is that the economy is not really recovering very well, and farmers are being being hit very hard, they're getting hit with hard times. And if you know anything about property taxes, if you can't pay them, the way that the state makes sure that you pay them is they just take your land. So they start confiscating all these lands, if you want to say foreclosure, whatever, they repossess the land. And basically what happens is you get a really angry group of farmers that start to band together, and they start their own little riots and revolts. And so they do things like burning down courthouses. They're just basically running wild across the state, and it doesn't look like they're going to be able to be brought under control. So anytime there's this major disturbance in the United States that states can't handle, oftentimes they do what Massachusetts did back then. They turn to the U.S. government for help. I mean, think of it. When we have riots or natural disaster that go on in our country, a lot of times the National Guard will be called in to handle those particular things. But there's no National Guard back then. And when Massachusetts is like, hey, we could really use some help putting this down, the national government's like, well, I don't have any troops and I don't have any money, so good luck with that. I mean, y'all wanted to be petty. I asked for $5. You won't even give me 50 cents. So even if I had troops, I wouldn't have any money to pay them. So the nice thing is that eventually, to make the story short and whatever, I know we're looking at 21 minutes, but to make it short, Massachusetts is able to actually finally get the rebellion under control, and that's where we're going to leave it for that. So basically what happens after this point, America is waking up and seeing it's just not working out. The Articles of Confederation just not working. And so basically what you have is this movement to have a meeting. Now the first meeting, don't worry about it. What the name of it was, nobody really shows up, and it's a failure anyways. But then we end up having a second meeting called, and they all gather, and we have basically what's called the Constitutional Convention. And if you're in my class, that was a lesson that came next. And we already know, most of those things. Maybe if I get time, I'll be able to make a video before the test on that specific thing. Virginia plan, New Jersey plan, all those fun things. So that's going to basically wrap it up. Learning target 2, determine what caused the Articles of Confederation to fail. So you've got, how many things did we mention? Probably more than I've got fingers on one hand. So that's going to pretty much wrap it up. We've covered all our learning targets. So I guess I'm going to try and do something new. Question of the day. So in your opinion, what was the biggest problem with the Articles of Confederation? Why don't you go ahead, if you want to try and respond to that, and put it in the comments below. I'll be making videos still throughout the school year. It's a little difficult right now. It was really hard to get this one made and published. But so if you like things like this, if I get a lot of thumbs up, then it kind of tells me to keep doing them. Or maybe, if I don't, for things like government and economics, I'm going to switch gears and start focusing on some AP Euro. I still have to do some professional development videos too. So, hopefully in the next couple weeks, I'll have another video. Until next time, we'll see you later.